right, welcome. So this is video 2, but it's really just lesson 1. The first video was the introductory video. If you missed it, if you've been in my classes before, that's fine. This is really the first lesson. I want to talk a little bit about the nature of the Bible and help you understand that the Bible is not really a book that I can just pull off the shelf, right, and treat it like it's Moby Dick or treat it like it's a play that was written by Shakespeare, or just one book with one author written at one time, okay? And you may never have had the reason to really think about this much, all right? But it's just not that kind of book. It's a compilation, okay? It is a work that took thousands of years, really, to put together by many different people over a long time, right? So it's just different, really, from any other book that you're going to pull off the Bible. Fortunately, we have it now, and it's easy for us to grab it. But that has really not been the case for most of history, all right? So let's talk about the nature of the Bible just a little bit, what we're talking about. You look at the Bible, and if you look at your table of contents, which is not cheating, that's fine. You can open your Bible, you can look at the table of contents, and you see that there are, in our version of the Bible, go ahead and blow your mind early, there are different versions, but in our version and in our table of contents, there are 66 books. Now, if you grew up in a slightly different Christian tradition, if you have what we think of as a Catholic Bible, you're going to have some books in there that we as Methodists, as the Protestant tradition, don't have. And we can talk sometime about how all that kind of came about. But there are different Christian traditions that have additional books, all right? But if you look at our Bible, the Protestant Bible, there are 66 books, okay? So let's talk a little bit about what the division, well, there are two big divisions, right? There's the Old Testament and New Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures, and then the New Testament. So just stop and think a bit, because I don't want to assume that you've thought about this a lot or that you know this, but think about the difference between the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament. The New Testament is the story of Christ and the story of the church that was built by Christ's followers. The Hebrew Scriptures are different because they're obviously before Christ was born, okay? So the dividing line between the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament would really be the birth of Christ, okay? So you're not going to find stories about Jesus in the Hebrew Scriptures. There are prophecies that we believe are about Jesus. There are things that we think help us understand what Jesus was doing and why he came. But you're not going to find the character Jesus in the Old Testament. Well, Faith, or are you? I mean, there are some stories where I might tell you that I think a particular character really is Jesus. But we'll get into that later, okay? You got to come to class to get that. Okay, but New Testament's about Jesus and his church. Old Testament, Hebrew Scriptures before that. All right, what languages were they written in? They weren't written in English, okay? The Hebrew Scriptures were written in Hebrew. That's kind of an easy one to remember. Hebrew Scriptures were written in Hebrew. And the New Testament was written primarily in Greek, because that was really the kind of the scholarly and the business language of the time, all right, during the time of Christ and shortly thereafter. So Old Testament written in Hebrew, New Testament written in Greek. How many authors are there? We don't know. We know who wrote some of the books, or we're pretty sure that we know. We're pretty sure we don't know who wrote some of the other books, right? So we judge them based on their content. We judge them based on what they say. That's how they've been judged over the centuries and handed down to us. But there are a lot of them we just don't know. We don't really know who wrote Genesis. We believe Moses probably wrote big chunks of the first 5 books of the Bible, but to say that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible is not the way scholars view it now. We believe that these stories were written over time by a lot of different people and then pulled together. We can talk about that more. timing. Now I want you to think hard about this for a little bit, okay? If you pull a book off of the shelf today, most, if it's a book or a novel or a play or a short story, they usually take place it may be over years, it might even be over someone's lifetime, right, or the lifetime of a family. But the Bible's a little different. You got to think about how this all came about. And there are 4 different parts of the timing that I want you to think about. So let's think about the book of Genesis. First book of the Bible tells about the creation and the stories of Abraham, the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, their children, things like that. Well, the event happened at some point, and we'll talk about this more when we'll do the timeline. The event happened at some point in time. We really don't know exactly when, but I put a date for Abraham of around 2,000 years BC. BC just meaning before Christ. Okay, so over 4,000 years ago for us. But that's kind of a shot in the dark, and people will argue about these dates all the time, and I'm not too worried about that. But let's just say for right now 2000 BC is when Abraham lived. Okay, well then when did the stories about Abraham start to be developed? When did people start telling? Well, his son Isaac told these stories. Others in Abraham's household told these stories. They probably started out being an oral tradition, because this was really before people were writing things down, all right? At least in this part of the world. So it was an oral tradition. Well, that happened at some point, that these stories became stories, but just oral stories. Then there were early written versions. Now let's say the early written versions may have happened 1,000 years later. It may have been 1,000 years later that the written versions, at least that we have, started to be developed. And here's another little mind-blowing thing. There were different early versions as these began to be written down. All right? It wasn't like, or I don't believe, you may disagree with me, but I don't think God handed somebody a scroll, a parchment scroll, that was Genesis. Okay? There were different early versions. There were different oral traditions. They came together. Someone pulled these together for Genesis. Maybe it was around 1,000. It's probably later than that, but let's just say 1,000. And then it continued to develop. And then eventually somebody put together the version that we have. And that's what we would call the canonized version, the version that the church now believes is kind of the official version of Genesis. For Genesis, maybe that happened around 600 BC, maybe a little bit later than that. ACT word of the day, canonized, that means the official church version. Think about it like that. When a book is canonized, it becomes part of the canon, not the one that shoots, that's 2 N's, but the C-A-N-O-N, the canon, which is what we have here in the Bible. This is what we have decided are the official books, okay? So that's our canon, all right? Good. So you got to realize that this took place, that putting together this book. Now, you now do this event, if there was an oral tradition, if there were early written versions, whatever the final canonized book became, now do that for all 66 books. And now you've got an idea of the complexity that goes into that book that now we pull off the shelf, okay? Do you have to understand or know all of this to believe in Jesus? No. To understand Jesus? No. That's one of the great things about Jesus, is that he made his gospel very simple. But I want you to understand as much of this as you can so you can think for yourself about all of these issues, right? Okay, translations. I told you that the Bible didn't start out in English, right? So for an English reader, okay, for our purposes today, you start with the Old Testament being in Hebrew. You start with the New Testament being in Greek. Well, now you've got to get it into English, right? Well, this took a long time. And it went from Hebrew. So let's talk about the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament that were written in Hebrew. First, they went from Hebrew to Greek, okay, which was more of kind of the current and common language of Jesus' time. Then they went from Greek to Latin, which I know you people don't study anymore because somebody made that decision, but yeah, I had to study it when I was in high school and wish you did too because your vocabularies would be much larger. Sorry, that's my first tirade, Faith. But it had to go into Latin. There's the Latin version is actually called the Vulgate, all right, because, well, anyway, never mind. And then it went eventually into English. And the first commonly available version of the English Bible that we think of most of the time is the King James Version, which was translated in 1611 A.D. Now, A.D. Anno Domini, meaning after the birth of Christ. Okay. And then from there, we've got a whole bunch of. You probably don't read the King James. You've probably got something else, and there are a lot of different translations now that groups of scholars have done, and a lot of them are really, really good, and that's fine. I use one called the New American Standard Bible. It's a personal preference. It's just the one that I really, really like. But there's the New International Version. There are all sorts of, and they can be very, very good as long as they were done by by good scholars. And I will tell you one little trick. You want to try to make sure that your version in English went all the way back to the original Hebrew and Greek, and that they're not just trying to translate from the Latin, because there could have been mistakes going from here to here, mistakes going from here to here, and then mistakes going from here to here, right? I mean, humans make errors, and I think God lets us make errors, and talk about that at a different time. But what you really want to get is a good version where you've got a group of scholars, probably not just one person, but a group of scholars in the languages who have gone back to the original Hebrew and the original Greek best they can, and then taken it straight into English. And that is what most of the translations that we use today around churches, that's usually what they are. But you do have to watch out for that a little bit. Okay, a little bit more about just what the Bible is. The sections and the types of writing. There are all different types of writing in the Bible. And that's important to know because some of it's poetry. You don't read poetry like you read a short story, right? You wouldn't do that today if you had to do it for school. You read poetry a little bit differently. It's got imagery. There are all sorts of allusions to other stories. There might be a play on words, a pun, or when somebody's using two words in a poem in a special way to try to create a meaning. Okay, and that's a little bit different than just reading a story about Bob went to the store and bought some groceries and came home and his house had burned down. It's a little different. So you got to think about that when you're reading the types of books in the Bible. So what have we got? Okay, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, we've got 39 books. It's a lot bigger than the New Testament, written over a much longer time period. 39 books in the Old Testament, Hebrew Scriptures. 5 of them, the first 5, we call the Law or the Torah. There's a lot of history in those books too, but they have always had, those first 5 books have always had kind of a special status, especially with the Jewish nation, the Jewish people, and Hebrew scholars. So the first 5 called the Law or the Torah, obviously beginning with Genesis. And then we've got 12 books that we call history books. So these are books like Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. This is actually when we start doing our biblical study in a couple of weeks, this is where we're going to start. We're going to start with the book of Judges. And I'll show you where it is on the timeline. And that's because last year we spent time going through Genesis and as much of Exodus as we could get through before the pandemic struck. There are poetry books. Think about Psalm is what most people, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, Song of Solomon. These are books of poetry, and they need to be read like poetry. And then there are 17 books that we call the prophets. A lot of people sometimes will call them the major prophets and the minor prophets. That gets a little confusing because all they meant by that was that the bigger, longer books, they called major, and the short books, some of them are very short, they called minor. They didn't mean that those short books weren't important. They just meant they were short. So now we tend to just call them all the prophets. These are books like Isaiah, which we know Jesus read and studied. Jeremiah, Lamentations, Micah, Hosea, Amos, books like that. So then you click over to the New Testament, right? Now we're talking about, we've had the birth of Christ. We're going to start with the birth of Christ. You have the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And a gospel is a book that tells the story of Christ's life. So these really are biographies, if you think about English class today, right? These 4 books are biographies of Jesus. They're different, and it's really interesting to get into the 4. They're all biographies of Jesus. You might ask, why aren't they all exactly the same? Why don't they all tell the same stories? Why don't they tell the same stories in the same way? Because there are different versions. And we'll talk about that some as we get through it. But, you had 4 authors, or sometimes maybe teams of authors, who were watching things, and they saw it a little bit differently, which to me is pretty neat that we have 4 instead of just 1. Because if we only had 1 gospel, I'd wonder what the other people thought. But we've got 4, and that helps you get a nice, rounded picture of Jesus' life and ministry. History, we say there's 1 book of history in the New Testament, that's Acts, because it talks about the history of the development of the church. It's actually Acts of the Apostles as they are building the very early Christian church. Then you've got epistles. Now this is your bonus ACT word of the day. I'm not charging you extra for this. An epistle is a fancy word that means letter. But for these biblical letters that early church leaders wrote to the various churches to try to help them figure out how to be Christians, really, and how to be a church, how to be a community of faith, we call them epistles. So you have Pauline epistles, that means they were written by Paul. You have the epistles of Peter, or Petrine epistles, and then there are James, there's some by John, and there's one that's called Jude. Paul wrote most of these, okay? Not all of them. And then there's 1 book of prophecy, and that's Revelation. It's not Revelations, okay? There's just 1 revelation. It's the book of Revelation, not the book of Revelations, okay? So that gives you just a taste of kind of the complexity of what we're dealing with when we pull what we call our Bible off of the shelves, right? And, we'll get into some of this more later, but it's just important for you to understand all of the work that went into this book, the thousands of years that went into this book, and the grace of God that He gave this to us, right? And that it doesn't just kind of flop down out of heaven as 1 book or tablet or whatever, and here you go, that He let humans be involved in the way all of this developed over time. Okay, thank you for listening. See you soon.